feminism was just completely embedded in my family culture and in the culture of the community around me. And it was seen as just an unassailable good. It was just totally unquestionable. Like, of course, feminism. And what I now know is that this was an example of how the inverted frameworks of the sexual revolution had become totally omnipresent and atmospheric. And all of this was reflected in what was presented through Anglicanism and manifested as a kind of inversion and breakdown of traditional structures that, again, were nonetheless unquestionable. So the countercultural ethos of the 60s and 70s that my parents had grown up in had sort of mellowed into what I experienced as a child in the 80s. And this was mirrored in the church's embrace of what I began to see when I was a child as the dismantling of the Anglican Church's theological and liturgical integrity. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Birth Bomb. This episode is going to be perhaps a multi-part episode, and it's also going to be part of a longer series about my journey and my family's journey to Orthodoxy and why I, after 40 years, almost 40 years, 38, 39 years of a lifetime in the Anglican Church, have left Anglicanism and am converting, along with my husband and our children, to Orthodox Christianity. In this episode, I'm going to read an essay that I recently wrote and published over on Substack. And I'm also going to discuss a little bit about a man called Calvin Robinson and the appointment of Sarah Mullally as Archbishop of Canterbury, even though I am no longer Anglican. One of the byproducts of living in a transitional era during the fall of one empire and the installation of another is the corruption, distortion, manipulation, and inversion of language. I used to feel a certain degree of outrage about this. Frankly, it used to drive me nuts. And while I do still often find it irksome, I've also developed a modicum of maturity, and I can recognize that this phenomenon is inevitable to an extent, an expression of human frailty in a fallen world. But the degree to which we're seeing this play out now is also the result of a uniquely intense measure of depravity, spiritual lack, and delinquency in this day and age, along with an ultra heavy duty influence of the demonic. The latter, as I pointed out to my 3-year-old recently when he told me that the devil made him smack his sister, is not the unavoidable conquering of a hapless victim or an excuse, but the very example of the willingness that we all display from time to time, and often from moment to moment, to choose to sin. No, the devil did not make you hit your sister. The devil invited you to choose to hit your sister. And no matter the magnitude or ferocity of that temptation, the responsibility for succumbing to it remains yours, my sweet boy. And I'm here for you, I love you, and I will help you repent and repair. I certainly don't always succeed in mothering with grace in a way that mirrors just a little, hopefully, the grace of the Theotokos, and the way that Christ, her Son, offers all of us the authentic, incisive love of rigorous truth, but occasionally I do get it right. Just as the devil does not make us lie or steal or cheat, another's words do not ever make us act. The issue of the abdication of responsibility and of choosing to manipulate a person's words and to assume of another bad faith is far more nuanced than physical violence, to be sure, and I do maintain that words are not violence. But like all sin, there are similarities. Especially during times of widespread disintegration and social unrest, any attempt to define one's terms will be deliberately misinterpreted and reflexively taken in bad faith by cowards, bad actors, and dimwits, and in particular by those who, despite having nothing truly insightful to offer, nonetheless seek to aggrandize themselves by employing the only strategy they have at their intellectual disposal for gaining a sense of importance and influence: fabricating faux controversy vilifying others, and inviting those who are similarly disenfranchised and alienated to find an ersatz sense of belonging via that age-old tribal impulse to unite in hating and villainizing a scapegoat. This gesture has always been alive and well in the birth world, and it's been interesting to find myself a target of it lately, accused of various fabrications and imputed motivations by lost and lonely women I've never met and don't know anything about, but who have entirely of their own volition and imagination fashioned themselves into the fervent ex-acolytes of a cult they themselves conjured and placed me at the apex of by virtue of their bizarre obsession with me. It's both sad and funny, and while the dystopian scope of it all is facilitated by the internet, it's also the oldest thing in the book. Glory to God for all things. This experience has been the most effective form of refinement I've ever been through and has separated the wheat from the chaff with alacrity, and I thank God for the strength to withstand the onslaught, which has at times been harrowing, mostly on account of how bafflingly absurd and pathetic it all is. Inciting a mob and imposing tyranny are two sides of the same coin. Neither represent true generative power, but rather inferential force. Again, this idea of inferred or latent force is not violence itself, but it is a supplication to it. Coercion, authoritarianism, and domination are the antithesis of real power. Yet those who love their own subjugation and enslavement, and so many among the lost and fragile do, are the perfect partners, victims, of the would-be dictator, or true cult leader or mob mistress. In the end, however, despite the real emotional and in some cases material impacts of coercion, we do always have a choice. Consent is always in play. This dynamic came into sharp relief during the reign of Rona in 2020. I witnessed the majority of our friends, family members, and acquaintances strenuously assert that they had no choice but to accept the government's special medicine. If they refused, they would lose their jobs, their livelihoods, their right to play on the hockey team or to dine at their favorite restaurant. No, dear, you elected to capitulate to coercion because you valued your perceived comfort, your perceived stability, and your perceived social standing more than you valued your body, your conviction, and your spiritual principles. And now you're going to deny this truth and play the victim.
If you're a mother, or if you're thinking of becoming pregnant, or if you're simply a human being curious about the nature of our origins, our purpose, and our connection to God, I want to warmly encourage you to check out my Amazon best-selling book, Portal: The Art of Choosing Orgasmic, Pain-Free, Blissful Birth. Part memoir and a chronicle of my own experience of giving birth to my first 9 children, part guidebook for women who are curious about exploring the possibility of pain-free, blissful birth, and part capacious, philosophical, poetic exploration of the power we have been granted by God to choose every thought, response, and reaction, which in turn orchestrates the shape of our lives. Portal is my love letter to humanity. It's the culmination of over 20 years of work as a birth consultant and birth witness, and of course, my own experience as a mother of now almost 11 children. Portal is available now on Amazon.com, and if you happen to be among the thousands of people who've read it and loved it, I would be so grateful for your glowing 5-star review, which will help to continue to propel Portal into the hands of mothers who will benefit from it.
The fact that a small minority did walk away from jobs, businesses, investments, and in some cases surrendered their entire lives to protect their integrity and their children's bodies, proves the commitment to self-delusion and servitude that most people revealed. It's this propensity towards victimhood and self-deception that mob instigators will always exploit with great success and with distinctive ease during times of intensified pressure and hardship. Yes, this dark tendency is simply part of being human, but it's also seeded and exacerbated by structural breakdown. When people are awash in fear, they tend to cleave to a common enemy and to turn away from accountability in droves. The origin, I now believe and see evidenced all around me, of the decadence and materialism that gives rise to the breakdown is a turning away from God and from the very self-responsibility that is at the heart of Christ's teachings. I, like most of my ancestors since Henry VIII, was born and raised within the Anglican Church, which in many ways is an embodiment of the subtle insidiousness, inherent corruption, and moral equivocation that is writ large in our current culture. I would even go so far as to say that Anglicanism was an early expression of wokeness, if we're willing to lump in justifying uxoricide with sterilizing children, which clearly I am. This is not to say that I feel any real resentment towards Anglicanism or Anglicans. I had a very positive experience in the Anglican Church growing up, and I know and believe that the vast majority of Anglicans are good, decent people, striving to do right, while confusedly adhering to a religion that is both ideologically rigid while ultimately devoid of any real standard. My questioning of the void that is Anglican theology began during my early childhood, and although I remained stubbornly loyal to the Anglican Church throughout my adulthood until 6 years ago when I began inquiring into Orthodoxy, by the end, I was simply unable to reconcile my continued participation in Anglicanism with its outright hereticism, its blatant celebration of degeneracy, and what I recognize now as a total lack of principle within that institution. Over the course of my life, since my earliest memory, I have felt a continuous yearning not only for intimacy with God, but for a framework of sense making that actually made sense and that expressed my own internal knowing that the truth really is out there and in here and ever present. I have found this truth in Orthodox Christianity, which, as my spiritual father has pointed out, is not a religion or an ideology, but a life. I'm not suggesting that I understand the truth of Orthodoxy or any truth fully, or that I even believe that such an understanding is possible as a human being, nor do I believe that the perfection of the one true church can ever be fully or properly expressed or embodied by the fallible people who administer, represent, and populate it. But what I do see and know in the Orthodox Church is, finally, a cohesive structure, a hierarchy that mirrors God's creation, and a compass that continuously orients me towards grace, though I fall short time and time again. There are a multitude of reasons that so many people, exponential numbers at many churches, including ours, are converting to Orthodoxy at this time. And while the pitfalls of online orthodoxy are self-evident, I've dabbled in that too, though I'm grateful that my own process of inquiry began, as I said 6 years ago, before the orthosphere blew up as it has, or rather before I was aware of its existence, and that my own explorations of the faith were initiated, for the most part, by attending liturgy itself, and by reading some key books that gave a much broader and a deeper understanding than any online debate can encompass. And if anyone's interested in my book list, you can check the caption below. That said, many are coming to Orthodoxy through the online world as an access point to actually living the faith in a liturgical sense, which I suspect is an overall blessing, despite the risks. That's not to say I'm not intrigued, compelled, and moved by the theological arguments. I do fundamentally agree that the objections to sola scriptura, sola fide, papal infallibility, etc., are sound, and I absolutely recognize the significance of apostolic succession and the structure of the Orthodox Church itself as the body and bride of Christ, especially in contrast to the non-denominational worship experiences I've encountered over the years. These positions are undeniably correct, in my view. Yet none of these theological positions even come close to touching the profound, overarching corporeal truth that I experience and know in a visceral sense through liturgy as I enter the church and the glory of it washes over and through me. The immersiveness and shimmering beauty and intensity and gorgeousness of the liturgy is, without a doubt, heaven on earth. Liturgy is far more true than any theological or intellectual argument. To my mind, the theological discourse only supports this elemental truth that I, and so many others, have found in Orthodox liturgy. And there we go. That's my recent Substack post. As I said, you can read it over there if you like. And glory to God, Lee and I have just received word from our spiritual father that we will be baptized in December. Lee and I and all of our kids, and we're all so excited, and the kids are incredibly thrilled, and we're talking about saints' names and godparents, and there's a sense of nervous anticipation. And the more we've been immersed in Orthodoxy and engaged in the daily practice of living the faith, the more significant, serious, real it seems. And the more I see and feel how unready I am in some ways. But I'm also aware that if I were to actually want to delay baptism until this idea of being perfectly and properly ready, I would never do it. And I think maybe a good analogy here is motherhood or parenthood. I mean, literally no one is ready to become a parent. That's kind of the point. And this idea of acquiring an ideal readiness um, is generally how people feel when they never become parents at all. Anyway, we're all being baptized this December, including this new baby in my womb, which means that he or she will be the first child in our family born into Orthodoxy, which really feels incredibly special and also kind of stunning to think about, given that almost my entire family since the Reformation was Anglican or Church of England. But what that also means is that at some point in my lineage before that, we were Orthodox, as all early Christians were, arguably. So I published that essay that I just read on my Substack account just a couple of days ago, a few days ago. And almost immediately after I published it, I came across the news that the new Archbishop of Canterbury had been appointed. Sarah Mullally is, as I've read, a former nurse, of course, and she's now the head of the Church of England, the first woman to hold this position. And on one hand, it's kind of astonishing, and on the other hand, not in any way surprising at all. I watched part of her speech, her acceptance ceremony, or whatever the proper term for that might be, and in her address, she stated, and I quote, that she intends to be, quote, a shepherd who enables everyone's vocation and ministry to flourish, whatever their tradition, which is kind of a little bit weird that someone who is supposed to be the head of an institution that purportedly stands for a very specific tradition is going out of her way to pander to other traditions. But again, this is very much to be expected.
If you're a busy mom like I am, juggling meals, laundry, bedtime stories, homeschooling, or school drop offs, all while trying to find a moment to breathe, I get it. And I know very well from experience that especially when we're in the midst of full-on mothering, what can often fall by the wayside is our own bodies. I also know exactly what it feels like to look in the mirror and feel like a stranger in your own skin. 4 years ago, after giving birth to my 9th baby at the age of 41, I woke up one morning weighing nearly 180 pounds and with every symptom of so-called perimenopause. I felt disconnected, overwhelmed, and frankly, almost defeated. And it actually crossed my mind that maybe this is just what happens. Maybe this is the stage of life where I just have to accept that weight gain, brain fog, exhaustion, and that sense of feeling at the effect of my body was now normal. But I've never really been especially compliant when it comes to questionable societal narratives, and I decided instead to quietly embark on a personal experiment. An adventure, a quest, if you will, to discover if it were possible to not only lose weight, but to completely reimagine my relationship to food, movement, strength, and my own sense of embodiment, and to radically transform my body composition. And it turns out that it worked. Now, at the age of 44, I am in the best shape of my life, and I have completely eradicated all of those symptoms of so-called perimenopause. That journey led me to create Temple. Temple is not just another fitness program. It's not about quick fixes or cookie-cutter meal plans. It's about you, your mind, your body, and your spirit. It's about understanding the deeper reasons why we get stuck, why we struggle to create lasting change, and how to break free from patterns of self-sabotage for good. In Temple, I'll guide you through the exact, practical, and metaphysical steps that I took to nourish my body and to learn once again to move with purpose and to build strength, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally as well. More importantly, I'll help you rewrite the story that you've been telling yourself about what's possible for your life, which will inevitably result in dramatic physical changes. What I want more than anything is for every woman to feel as vital, vibrant, strong, flexible, and alive as I do, and I know that it's possible for you as well. Join me in Temple. I can't wait to see you there. Link is in the show notes.
She also touched on issues within the Church of England, particularly regarding this idea of safeguarding and the misuse of power, which is also kind of ironic to me. I mean, obviously, this is a reference to the abuses that took place under the banner of the Church of England in the past, many abuses. The church is, in my view, still facilitating abuse of a different kind. So apparently, Mullally is pro abortion, which doesn't really make sense to me, but she's also opposed to medically assisted death or state sanctioned murder, depending on how you see it. And yet the Anglican Church also refuses to decry the gender identity movement, which predates upon mentally unwell people and profits from mutilating their bodies, which is not very Christian, really. And of course, she's also very pro the blessing of same sex unions and even sexual unions. She went out of her way to say, which it's again just it's sinful according to the Bible. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, this is the Anglican, like, welcome to the Anglican Church. This is what it's all about. And naturally, Mullally also expressed gratitude to the women who preceded her, acknowledging their support and inspiration, even though there were no women who preceded her as Archbishop of Canterbury. She's the first, and we're supposed to be all excited and happy about this because this is feminism. Wonderful. Now, I've spoken about this topic in the past, but I feel compelled to revisit this and to continue to deconstruct my experience in the church and my own timeline in faith in a kind of recursive way through the lens of all of these modern happenings, particularly as it pertains to my transition from Anglicanism to Orthodoxy, and especially as I reflect on my childhood and the questions that I was asking even then about the coherence and the validity of the Anglican Church. It's just so amazing to me that all of the issues that troubled me as a child are now coming to the forefront. And really, one of the earliest points of dissonance for me as a young child was the presence of women clergy. It it didn't make sense to me, even though I was actively encouraged, conditioned, even indoctrinated to view female clergy as a particular hallmark of Anglican virtue. Because, of course, I was raised in a feminist, progressive, liberal household in this family of academics that were deeply embedded in the zeitgeist of the time. You know, this was 80s aspirational secularism, really. And feminism was not just embraced in my family or celebrated. It wasn't really that. It was actually more that feminism was just completely embedded in my family culture and in the culture of the community around me. And it was seen as just an unassailable good. It was just totally unquestionable. Like, of course, feminism. And what I now know is that this was an example of how the inverted frameworks of the sexual revolution had become totally omnipresent and atmospheric. And all of this was reflected in what was presented through Anglicanism and manifested as a kind of inversion and breakdown of traditional structures that, again, were nonetheless unquestionable. So the countercultural ethos of the 60s and 70s that my parents had grown up in had sort of mellowed into what I experienced as a child in the 80s. And this was mirrored in the church's embrace of what I began to see when I was a child as the dismantling of the Anglican Church's theological and liturgical integrity. But I actually see it very, very differently now. So I'm going to get into that. But the ordination of Sarah Mullally is in so many ways emblematic of this whole trajectory. And of course, Mullally is receiving adulation from publications like The Guardian and criticism from conservatives. And from my position as a former Anglican, the whole situation is just kind of hilarious and it reveals Anglicanism as the circus that it has always been. And I know exactly who Sarah Mullally is. I don't know her personally at all. I don't mean that. But I know her archetype very well. And I don't want to comment on her as a person at all or on her character as an individual because I don't know anything about her. I assume she's wonderful and a good person and she has the very best of intentions. But I know her ilk and I know exactly the persona and the archetype that she represents because I grew up surrounded by Sarah Mullally's in the affluent, snobbish, kind of Tony West Side church that I attended throughout my entire childhood and through my adolescence and into my adulthood. And this church was exclusively white in the 80s, less so in the 90s, but in the 80s certainly. And its congregation was composed almost entirely of first or second generation Englishmen and women, Britons. A significant portion of the church population consisted of people who had emigrated from England to Vancouver within their lifetimes, with a smaller minority, like my own family, being of English descent but born in Canada. Maybe not technically a smaller minority, but half and half, maybe. I mean, it was basically an English cultural center. And as I mentioned, my background obviously is English and Irish. And since the Reformation, the vast majority of my family has been Anglican, but my paternal grandmother was Catholic. So aside from her line, Anglicanism was the dominant thread running through my lineage on both sides of my family. And I'm very much a product of that culture, for better or worse. In fact, I now see Anglicanism as pretty much entirely a culture. It's the culture of Englishness. It's the culture of a loyalty, more or less, to the crown. It's a culture of empire bootlickers, far more than it was ever a religion. Certainly, it was never really a spiritual orientation. I don't think it's Christianity. Now, this might sound offensive or like a sweeping generalization or an unfair characterization, but I don't think it is. And that also doesn't diminish the true fact that many Anglican people, many people who consider themselves to be Anglican, are good people who are striving to be spiritual and to be in communion with God and to, do all the right things. Of course, that's true.
Tearing during birth is one of the biggest fears that new mothers have about the birth process itself, and for very good reason. A severe perineal tear can cause immense pain and discomfort postpartum, and it can also affect our body image, our sense of self, and our intimate relationship. And yet so much of the advice you'll find out there about preventing tearing is ineffective or downright counterproductive. There is, however, a formula for optimizing your chances of not tearing during birth, and I've created a course based on my 24 years of experience, including the births of my own 10 babies, to support mothers in choosing the kind of birth that is truly easeful and that you can emerge from intact and integral. The program is called Integral, and it's a deeply insightful, practical, actionable course that will give you the tools to choose a birth in power. The link is in the show notes.
But within the church, I grew up surrounded by this particular archetype of women that is very much in alignment with the aura, the mien, the disposition, and the outward presentation of Sarah Mullally. Kind of officious, masculine, academically inclined busybodies whom I often assumed to be closeted lesbians. I mean, who knows? But they presented as, if not strictly lesbians, then a kind of lesbian heterosexuals in their evident rejection of femininity, just as there are many men, increasing numbers of men these days who are gay heterosexuals, men who may not have a physical attraction to other men, but whose behavior and energy and impact in the world is totally neutered and inverted and feminized. And I'm not trying to be mean or nasty at all. I've struggled with this in my life. I have in many ways masculinized myself unconsciously for the sake of survival and in response to growing up in this atmosphere where femininity was seen as a weakness. And in a family in particular where my mother was the provider, my mother was the leader, she was the authority, and she was really the engine of our home and our family. My father was very passive and tortured and depressed and anxious and traumatized. It was a very dysfunctional household for that reason primarily, which, created all these other issues. Like that's the core, right? I have now come to very much recognize that if that core hierarchy and structure and leadership that needs to be held by a strong man who is the leader and the patriarch is not present, everything else falls apart. Everything else falls apart in these concentric circles, and we end up in a society that we have today where people are just completely disintegrated, really. And that disintegration was totally mirrored in the church. And being immersed in an environment where so many of the women around me had cultivated this kind of desexualized masculine demeanor had an effect on me, obviously. It, it would have to, it does. These were women who exuded this air of, yeah, officiousness and kind of smarmy self-righteousness and a tendency to virtue signal, which is also what their appearance and outward presentation was all about. It was like a gesture of loyalty to the feminist project and to progressivism overall, to like be both masculine but sort of matronly. Just the whole vibe was really interesting. And what was really drummed into me was that these were the women that I should aspire to. These were women of achievement. And that in order to acquire power and status as a woman, one had to, obviously, eschew and disavow femininity and motherhood, especially. These were women who clearly harbored, well, from my perspective anyway, a deep-seated disdain for the traditional markers of femininity, who overtly rejected beauty and grace in favor of an institutional academic rationalist posture. And as a young girl, I absolutely noted the bizarre contradiction that this incorporated. Like, these were women, feminist women and strident champions of women's rights, so they said, who nonetheless hated womanhood and themselves from my perspective, and who saw motherhood as largely contemptible. Now, some of them were mothers, but they didn't really seem to enjoy motherhood. They largely made motherhood seem like an afterthought, like a very low priority item. And from my perspective, they perceived motherhood as degrading and uninteresting and devoid of any inherent value. What they did prioritize was institutional leadership, climbing the academic or corporate ladders, and frankly, the pursuit of power. And I think for many of these women, like real institutional power wasn't accessible, but like a form of power for whatever it's worth within the Anglican Church was accessible. And I know it sounds like I'm being awful right now. I don't really have a lot of respect for this point. It's true, but I also know that these women absolutely had good intentions, and they really did believe that what they were doing was valuable, virtuous. And I think that they also like really did have good intentions. I'm not trying to at all smear them as individuals, but really just to try to articulate the social dynamics as I saw them and see them now, because this is important. This is affecting everyone's lives and experiences. Now, I want to talk about this more in a separate episode of this podcast, but I'll just say here that the socio-sexual dynamics in the Orthodox Church, as I've experienced it thus far, are completely different, entirely different. Our Orthodox community is the first experience that I have had in my life of a hierarchy, a framework, a structure, a community that is functional, truly functional, not perfect, but functional, and that mirrors the correct biological, social, and spiritual order. It's the only community I've ever experienced where I'm not only allowed to be a woman in spite of what is reflected in the culture, which is either, this like the trad wife fantasy, which totally isn't real. I don't actually think, I mean, people love to hate on the trad wife thing, but none of that is real, obviously. Uh, Or there's the overtly sexualized, you know, stuff that is also terrible. Or there's the feminist thing. And so the Orthodox community that I have now been embraced by, I and my husband and our children, it's the first experience that I've had of functional sexual politics. And it's not even politics isn't even the right word, like functional social dynamics that is rooted in the proper, correct expression of masculinity and femininity, balanced.